Welcome everyone to the Global Network Initiative and Telecommunications Industry Dialogue discussion about human rights impact assessments. I'm guessing there's going to be people wandering in over the next few minutes, but I'm conscious of the time and starting sort of roughly on time. So I think maybe we'll begin now, and hopefully others will join us over the next 5 or 10 minutes. So firstly, welcome to everyone. I'm really delighted to be moderating a panel about human rights impact assessments. I think there are so many sort of general conversations and discussions about what the role of companies and the responsibilities of companies might be. And I think it's good to be spending a little bit of time getting into some specifics in terms of what are realistic expectations of companies and what can companies be expected to do. I'll say a little bit about myself and how the panel's going to work, and then ask our panel to begin. So I'm Susan Morgan. I'm Executive Director of the Global Network Initiative. We bring together companies in the tech sector with human rights groups, investors and academics, and we're focused on the protection and advancement of free expression and privacy rights around the world. We're focused specifically on the role of companies and what companies can do when they receive requests from governments. I'm delighted to say that we've got 6 panelists. We've got a number of people who are working directly in companies on these issues, and then also 3 organizations represented who are providing advice and guidance and support to companies. So there should be a good range of perspectives in the room. I'm going to ask each panel member to say a few remarks, probably about 4 or 5 minutes each, and then to pose a question for discussion amongst the panel. Also keen to see that we've got some audience participation, so we'll make sure that at least sort of 30 minutes at the end there's time for questions, and hopefully the discussion will stimulate a lot of interest and discussion. So I'm going to first of all ask Patrick from TeliaSonera to introduce himself and say a few words about TeliaSonera and also the industry dialogue. So Patrick, over to you.
Thank you, Susan. So my name is Patrick Celius. I'm based in Stockholm, Sweden, working for TeliaSonera, which is a full-fledged operator present in the Nordic and Baltics and in Spain and in Eurasia. And TeliaSonera is also one of the founding participating companies of the Telecommunications Industry Dialogue. I'm here together today with my colleague, Mr. Yves Nissim from Orange. And when we discussed within the Industry Dialogue and together with the GNI what would be an interesting theme for a workshop here today, we saw that human rights impact assessments are really important tools for companies to raise to get the answers to the difficult questions, to get the hard facts. What are our human rights impact risks and how to assess them? And it also, the tool, the human rights impact assessment tools help the internal discussion within the company on how to address these issues. We also see that we are now in a good point of time to review how we work with human rights impact assessment. We have many telcos and internet companies that have done such assessments recently. We have the last year's revelations that we spoke about already earlier today. And as I mentioned at the previous panel, we have a maturity when it comes to implementing the Protect, Respect, Remedy framework. So the human rights impact assessments help us in a how-to. I don't know if you want me to go into now how we worked as a company, TeliaSonera, with, yeah. Sure. So when we decided a couple of years ago at TeliaSonera to do a 360 degrees human rights impact assessment, we looked into various options in the market for a consultancy who can help us. So we have expertise inside our company, but to really do this the right way, we we knew that we needed a consultancy. And when we looked into who could help us, we decided to work with the Danish Institute for Human Rights. Alan Jørgensen is here today and can tell more about their work. And what I want to, we choose the Danish Institute for expertise, and we knew that they had done some work in the sector before, and they had and have a tool available which you can study online. But then the Danish Institute for Human Rights helped us to elaborate their own tool, and we did that together to cover new issues such as freedom of expression, privacy, and protection of children. Because what needs to be remembered, and I think what will be discussed during this panel also, is when a company does a human rights impact assessment, it's a 360-degree review of issues. So it includes not only privacy, freedom of expression, and protection of children. It includes due diligence, employment practices, community impacts such as anti-corruption work, responsible supply chain management, etc. And that's one of the challenges. If you have operations like TeliaSonera in some 20 countries, some 30,000 employees, and you want to cover in one exercise all of these issues, it becomes rather soon a big exercise, and that's where you need external expertise. So that's an introduction. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Patrick, and welcome to those who've just joined us. And I'm going to hand over now to Alan, who will introduce his work at the Danish Institute and say a few opening remarks. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan. And it's good to see that the room is starting to get as crowded as the stage is. That's very good. So I'm Alan Jørgensen, and I'm Director for Human Rights and Business at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. We're a national human rights institution, and that means we're actually an independent state institution in Denmark. But we work within the context of our international programs a lot with business, and that's the context in which we've worked with Patrick and his team at TeliaSonera. And I'm very grateful for the invitation and for the event that GNI has put on and the Industry Dialogue has put on to discuss the experiences that we all have. I would say that this morning the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights have been mentioned quite a few times, and I think I'm hard-pressed to find an industry sector where the guidelines, the guiding principles, are as applicable and as pertinent as they are for the internet and telecommunications industries and the ensuing human rights issues around expression and privacy. Because these are truly transboundary issues that no single actor in a national jurisdiction can hope to handle. And the UN Guiding Principles really are all about providing that global governance framework that are sorely needed, including in this sector. Lots of trends in terms of application since the guiding principles were adopted in 2011. The trend is very much now to see it implemented in a national context. And it's very important that the ICT industry also follows that same model. I would say based on the TeliaSonera assessment that we did together with Patrick, one of the essential elements that we found we needed to do was to actually develop this tool. So how do you convert international human rights standards on freedom of expression and privacy into an actual benchmark that a company can use to assess its impacts and its policies and procedures against? And we have experience from that going back 10 years on human rights compliance assessment, and that's the tool that Patrick is referring to. But we had to actually fill some gaps in relation to these specific two rights. And that tool is there now. It has been used in this one instance, and it's available for other companies to use. And we would definitely encourage companies to apply it and tell us about the experience, because these things are not easily developed overnight. Some of the key questions when you do a human rights impact assessment in an internet company or a telco is, if you compare, for example, with a mining company, who are the rights holders? The rights holders who are affected by your operations as an internet company or a telecommunications provider is an enormous, amorphous mass of people. So how do you actually engage meaningfully with these people? The guiding principles in the UN instruct you that you need to meaningfully engage with potentially affected rights holders. But for companies like Orange and TeliaSonera, who are they actually? and particularly in oppressive regimes, how do you actually have a meaningful dialogue with them? That's one of the key challenges that I would like to discuss. The guiding principles also instruct companies that they need to participate in remediation of harmful adverse human rights impacts that they have contributed to. How do you do that if you don't know who you're impacting? That's again a particular challenge for this sector that I think is not, there's no easy answer to. The guiding principles are also helpful in that they allow companies to focus on the most severe issues. So you need to start addressing those human rights impacts that are the most severe in terms of their consequences. And there we need to think about the interrelated nature of human rights. So the kinds of events that Patrick described also this morning about interception, about real-time access, those events that occur online have offline consequences. How do you actually assess the severity of these consequences? It may be that real-time access is, it's a problem, but it's a bigger problem in Uzbekistan than it is in Sweden because the ensuing consequences for people and their rights are much more severe. So companies need to think along these lines as well. When you conduct, at least as an external person, a human rights impact assessment in an internet company or telco on these issues, you come up against the Chinese wall. So there are issues, there are events that the company is not allowed legally to talk about. Maybe even the people inside the company doing the assessment do not have the full picture. So that's also something that detracts from the reliability of human rights impact assessments, which is a problem. The question I need to, or want to pose alongside these other questions is, for any one company, these issues around major events are very intractable and difficult to handle. How do we sort of make sure that companies doing human rights impact assessments at a country level use these assessments to generate national dialogue with multiple stakeholders on how to actually handle these issues? And I'd like us to sort of share experiences and views on how that could be taken forward as quickly as possible. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Alan. And moving quickly along to Steve at Microsoft, who will say a few opening remarks. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Steve Crown. I'm a Vice President and Deputy General Counsel at Microsoft, primarily advising businesses on how we move into international markets and how we grow into, we refer to it as a device and services company, or it's more recently we're speaking of it's about mobile first and it's about cloud first. We actually think that there will be ubiquitous computing and everyone is going to have lots of ambient intelligence out there. We will contribute to that, but what's our responsibility as we think about that? We have people in over 100 countries, so we think about this as we're taking care of our own people as well as others. We have to be responsible corporate citizens. We have a global human rights statement where we talk about the issues you brought up, Patrick, it's about the labor force, but it's especially here for our conference on a secure, free internet, issues of what do we do to protect the rights of users. I think one of the great things that Ruggie brought forth in the principles was, don't look at what the laws are, think instead about who are your users and what are their rights. Start with the user as the way of grounding yourself in what you should be doing. And so one of the things I like to encourage our people to do is think about that. Think about the particular feature. If we're collecting data, why? And depending upon the data, should we be collecting it in every country? So for the panel, I think one interesting question will be, at what level of granularity do you look at what business you're doing in what country, and then how do you prioritize, and how do we learn from each other?
That's great. Thanks, Steve. And Yves, over to you.
My name is Yves Nissim. I'm the Deputy Chief CSR Officer of the Orange Group, a multinational telco company. We do operate in 32 countries, mostly France, Europe, Africa, North Africa, and Middle East. We operate in 200 countries when we consider the B2B business. And as Patrick said, we are part of the founders of the telecom industry dialogue. And as part of the principle that was founded last year in the industry dialogue, we have principle number 3, which is impact assessment and due diligence. And we realized after looking around in all the impact assessments that have been done for due diligence that we didn't have a big picture of the whole group, meaning the whole countries. Of course, we could follow the headlines of the news and decide what country was the country which was more at risk, but we decided to do it more scientifically with the tool. We looked around and choose to do so, to have an external body to do it, and we choose Maplecroft, that will express themselves in a minute. So we did that. We have a picture of every single country in which we operate. We have a ranking. So going forward in the direction that is really the direction I'm hearing in this conference since this morning, we've been doing a lot of dialogues on the international level. We are sitting with a GNI. We are meeting a lot of stakeholders, NGOs, industries, internet companies. But this level of dialogue is not yet over, of course. We have still a lot to do, but we need now to go down into the countries and really do it within the countries. So the way forward for us is to try to pick up the countries in which the human rights impact assessment was the worst, and try to start on those countries, as you said, to look at people that work with us, at the people we are serving inside the countries. And one big question we do have, once we have this big picture, you know, we have our footprint, here are the good countries, here are the medium countries, and here are the bad countries. The main question we do have is, how do we address the problem of risk? What kind of levers do you have to try to tackle the risk? What kind of weight do you put on the different signals you're getting from the analysis to be able to find a good way to approach the dialogue within the country? We did ask Maplecroft to input into their different parameters to try to rank all the countries. We did ask to put the number of people we have on the ground. You know that telecom companies have this particularity that they have a large number of people on the ground. So we did add this parameter into the analysis. And we also added another parameter, which is the number of customers we have in each country. So the weight that was used in the tool used by Maplecroft used those two parameters. So my question forward is, what are the other parameters we could use to make a better description of the risks we do have before starting to launch a multi-stakeholder dialogue locally in each country?
That's great, thanks. Thanks, Yves. And Lisbeth.
Thank you very much, Susan, and thank you, Yves, for introducing. My name is Liz Campbell. I'm the Associate Director of Human Rights and Societal Risk at a small company, about 100 plus, located in Bath in the United Kingdom. We are a for-profit private sector company that was started out of the knowledge base of several of the universities in southwest England. Our role is that we are a global risk analytics firm. Our entire remit, if you will, is based on data collection. We collect, over the past 8 years, data across the spectrum of political risk, economic risk, natural hazard risk, global growth risk, and of course, human rights risk. So the fact that we collect data and we report out on data across the spectrum of development in many areas. This gives us a nice vantage point, if you will, to extend our human rights analysis into some of the areas that we've been talking about today, some of the areas that the President mentioned in his speech, and some of the areas around global governance and other democratic transitions that we've been talking about here today. We have about 2,000, between 1,500 and 2,000 indices altogether across these different spectrums, of which 200 of them we report out on every year in a number of atlases, and the most popular one is the Human Rights Risk Atlas. These atlases are used by companies in order to assess their risk, as Yves has mentioned. Yves approached us, or Orange approached us in about October of 2013 with their request for an assessment, a preliminary human rights impact assessment framework for their countries of operation. So working collaboratively with Orange, we developed a template for the ICT sector using the indices and our 8 years of trendline data that we have across 197 countries. And we provided a template for the, first and foremost, for the telecom industry. And then once we had achieved that, we agreed with Orange on the specific indicators and indices that we should look at in their approximate 30 countries of operation. So those indices were actually weighted 80-20, and 80% of the weighting was on human rights and many of the topics that we're talking about here specifically today, and in particular freedom of expression and privacy. But the other 20% was around actually what we've been talking about in the other sessions, which was corporate governance, conflict and corruption, and rule of law in particular. Once we did this weighting and this methodological exercise for Orange, we were able to determine the extreme risk and the high risk countries that they operate in. And just very briefly, 2/3 of those countries that they operate in, not surprisingly, were extreme risk and high risk. And the majority of those countries, the risk was attributed to suppression of societal protest and general suppression, if you will, across many different societal factors. So this was the preliminary step that we took for Orange to prepare them for in-country human rights risk assessments. So that now that Orange has, as Yves has said, an indication of the most extreme risk countries, they can prioritize where they would like to go next in terms of assessing their on-the-ground activities. And there's a number of steps around human rights impact assessment, as I'm sure you're all aware, starting with research and stakeholder engagement and analysis and so on, that we will go to the next step in this project with Orange. So thank you.
Great, thanks, thanks Liz. And last but certainly not least, over to Lucy at the Institute for Human Rights and Business.
Hi there. My name's Lucy Purden. I manage the ICT programme at the Institute for Human Rights and Business. We're a not-for-profit organisation based in London, and we work on the corporate responsibility to respect human rights as outlined in the UN Guiding Principles. One of the projects that we did recently, which a lot of people in this panel were involved with and some people in this room, was a guide for the European Commission that we wrote with an organisation called Shift on how to implement the Guiding Principles specifically in the ICT sector. Another project that is probably of significance to this panel is with the Danish Institute for Human Rights. The Institute for Human Rights and Business have set up a centre in Myanmar called the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business, which is based in Yangon. It's a centre that is designed to be the first port of call for businesses who are investing in the country, and it's providing an impartial space for discussion with governments and business and civil society to advance responsible business practice as the country opens up. We've employed about 16 people now, 16 local people that we're training as researchers, and it's headed up by a wonderful lady called Vicky Bowman, who was used to be the UK ambassador to Myanmar. So it's a very exciting space. So any companies who are going through Myanmar, you must call into this great place. So one of the projects for MCRB is a sector-wide impact assessment for the country, or a SWIA, as we call it. At the moment, we're just completing the oil and gas sector SWIA and tourism, and then ICT is next on the list, so that'll start later this year. These sector-wide impact assessments are not intended to replace any companies' impact assessments, but it's a base that companies can start from. It's been developed through field research and consultation, and there'll be legal framework analysis, which will be really useful for companies, and a summary of potential impacts based on subjects such as land and labour. And then also there'll be recommendations to governments and businesses and targeted actions that companies should take. So ICT will start later this year. Obviously, people in this room know that in the past year there's been a lot of action, a lot of activity in Myanmar regarding the telecom licenses being given out, new laws being drafted, on spectrum laws being drafted. So we can see some of the issues already that are going to come up in terms of freedom of expression, seen as what we've seen in the law already, and even things like land rights and where base stations are going to be put. We can see that a lot of these issues are going to come up. But saying all of that, actually in the guiding principles, impact assessments aren't specified as an instruction for companies to do. It talks about assessing impact and as the process of due diligence, but it doesn't actually outline that impact assessments are what companies should do. But this is something that companies have taken on, I guess, because they've done risk assessments in other areas. So I guess my question for discussion is, how can companies ensure that the impact assessments aren't just ticking the box and then they're put on a shelf? How does a company integrate the results of the impact assessment into the rest of their due diligence process? Thank you.
Great, thanks, Lucy. So I'm going to move into some very specific questions around human rights impact assessments now. I think there's sort of specific questions about how you do them and how often you do them, and how and sort of whether you do them in a more tailored way or not. And then I think there's some broader questions for discussion as well. I'm going to start off with the specifics, and I'm going to try and roll a couple of questions into one so that we can get through as many questions as possible. And then, as I say, for the last half an hour, I'd like to open it up for discussion with the audience as well, because I know it's always better to have some audience participation. So just first off, I think there's sort of three questions I think I'd roll together and be sort of interested in getting the views of the panel. I think the first one is really, how can a company focus on the most material issues? Every company has sort of many issues to address and look at. So what's the sort of mechanism? How can companies focus on the most material? I think the second, just some very specific questions around how often should you perform a human rights impact assessment, and are there triggers for when you need to perform a more specific assessment than perhaps you do first of all? And then finally, just interested to hear the views on the panel in terms of the level of granularity that you need. If you've got a company that's operating in many, many markets with very different products and services and very different businesses, how do you prioritize, and what kind of level of granularity do you need? I'm not going to pick on anyone first. I'm just going to see if there's a volunteer, and then I will pick on someone if there isn't. But it looks like Patrick, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. The question that I mentioned to you before the panel was that, as I said, a human rights impact assessment needs to address 360 degrees everything. And when we planned together with the Danish Institute our impact assessment, we looked at, this is very broad, and do we really need to look into issues as to, for example, acquiring land for putting up our masts, etc. And then we said, we can't really do away with that issue, because if it then turns out later on that there is really a huge risk and a big impacts as to people's rights, then how can we defend that our impact assessment did not cover that area? But it does bring complexity and challenges to the exercise. So my question is really back to how you phrased it. Because we know that freedom of expression and privacy are the most material ones, but we can't delete, as I see it for now, but I'm eager to hear views on the panel, how to prioritize within this 360 degrees exercise.
I do think at Microsoft we've concluded freedom of expression and privacy really are the two that trump the other sorts of things. Now, we do manufacturing, so we worry about worker conditions, payment, underage workers, how you can address those challenges which creep up on you, and then there's a continual process to make sure that things are working as your policies say they will. But within our services, a product like Word, the thing that you would install on your laptop, or now you would install on your iPad, a product like Word, we actually don't think that that's one that takes a lot of deep thought. We will allow people to create content just like they could with pens and papers. It's a very different story, though, when we start putting things in the cloud. When people are sharing that information and in practice entrusting it to us, we then have to think about how do we protect that? What is the reasonable expectation of privacy? Again, thinking back to the Ruggie notion of think about the rights you're trying to protect, not what the laws are in a particular place. So for us, that means we are very thoughtful about where we will place our data centers, where we store data, which then reserves for us the right to assert jurisdictional arguments if we think a right is being infringed by a demand of an authority. And I don't think you have quite the same flexibility in the telco sector, but we think about that. I'd also say that as to frequency, anytime we do a new feature, certainly with a new product release, if it's simply maintaining the features that are there, it's not as if there's a lot of new data. But when we add new features or we collect and offer new experiences based upon what's available through all the data in a cloud, we have to think about that. And we, again, prioritize by the countries that seem to us to present the greatest challenge. We rely upon Freedom House's ranking to help us determine where we should start that analysis.
Maybe I can just add to that a little bit, and between what Patrick has said and what Microsoft has just said a moment ago, I think that Maplecroft would have to come down the middle on this. So although freedom of expression and privacy comprises very heavy weighting and perspective in our analysis relative to the ICT sector, we have to, by virtue of the principles, by virtue of a number of other societal factors that we try to include for our customers, we factor in a number of other issues around human security and conflict, around vulnerable groups, that perhaps are more exposed to violations of freedom of expression and privacy, as well as rule of law and corruption. So once again, I think I mentioned this in my opening remarks. From our perspective, and as we move forward, as things, it's a very complicated and complex topic with what has happened in the past year around surveillance, around censorship, and around transnational organized crime and its impact. We are continually adding to our indices. We're continually looking for new ways to weight them in a rational way that we think is going to provide business with the best internal performance management metrics that we can.
Okay. I'll go next. I mean, materiality, one of the questions I think, especially in ICT, that we need to take very seriously is what Richard Allen said this morning. We're actually a human rights company. We deliver economic, social, and cultural rights. Especially when you talk to governments, they see us coming with all of this bad news, and we want to focus on the negative impacts. But actually, they say we need these companies because we need to drive development in our countries. And I don't think we as a human rights community have a very strong vocabulary around that. The guiding principles don't help us. They're not supposed to help us with that. But I don't think we will succeed in the materiality discussion with governments if we don't kind of crack that nut. And I think I would encourage everyone to think about that. How often to do it? I think a good example, I mean, mergers and acquisitions, joint ventures going, better late than never. So I think there are many companies who have paid a high price because they didn't look under the hood of what they bought or who they joined up with. I think the example that we heard this morning, the TeliaSonera freedom of expression policy, and the kind of due diligence that happens on each major event is actually a mini human rights impact assessment, trying to understand if we comply with this, what are going to actually be the human rights consequences for someone down the road? How serious is that? Ultimately, I think those decisions, if you take a guiding principles, very dogmatic stance, are actually linked to country entry and exit. Can you remain doing business in a country with, for example, unrestricted real-time access? if you don't have any leverage to deal with it. And that's why I continue to come back to this discussion of leverage and joint action in those very difficult countries, because otherwise over time it will be very difficult for the industry to remain in those countries.
Thanks. Just to add on to Alan's point about how often, I mean, in the ICT sector, it's got to be at the beginning of when a new product is launched or a new service, and because technology's changing all the time, this has got to be taken into account. I think it's very acute in the ICT sector, and reviewing business relationships, as Alan said, is really important. But with all of this information and the indices and all of this information, the company really needs to know, what's the tipping point? When is a company going to say no to a deal? When is a company going to pull out of a country if that is the last resort? It's fine having all of these indices and assessments, but out of all of that, has the company decided this is what we will not tolerate, this is our tipping point?
Okay, a few things. First, try to be in between Patrick and you into the 360. Let me give you my feeling. We are experiencing, as I used to say, dog years, which means in the field of human rights, we're going fast. Every year accounts for 7. And so I will just give you a snapshot of my feeling today about the importance of human rights assessment. There's definitely the freedom of speech and privacy. That's definitely a big one. It did not exist 2 years ago only. Okay. The second thing for us, for telcos, is definitely the social part of it. As I said, we have a lot of people on the ground. This is a huge effort we have to be responsible on, and that goes very high into the consideration of human rights impact. And the third one, which is a growing one also, is a civil society around us in the country where we operate. It does happen that telecom business is a business that many new venture entrepreneurs can grab on to build its own capacity, and we have a real responsibility to give access to this facility to the young entrepreneurs in the country where the business is starting, where the economy is growing, and that's definitely the third sector in which we need to be very responsible on. The second point I want to address is a granularity. In terms of reacting to infringement in human rights, usually the countries are alone. We are at the corporate level back in Paris. Things are happening in Tunis or in Egypt or in Mali recently or in Congo, and the reaction has to be done within half an hour. So it's the great thing that we do have some principles that we put top down to the country so they know what is the backbone of the company. But the reaction of every single country is their own challenge. They have to react very fast. So the granularity is very small. It's definitely on the level of the country. It's definitely on the level of where the headquarters of the company is within the country. Is definitely on the level of the relationship the company has with the governments. It's everything. This is a kind of granularity we do need, and that's what I would say.
I might make a bit of a pitch. I happen to sit on Susan's board of the Global Network Initiative, and one of the advantages there is we have stakeholders who are academics, we have NGOs, we have very strong and well-known human rights organizations. We're able to have a lot of conversations that happen as we're off the record, but they're quiet conversations. People will raise issues, or I can reach into that. One of the hard things is in a country like China, for example, where we do business, we have thousands of employees in China. It's just not practical to try to do a poll of what do the Chinese think their number one issue is, or who are all of the groups, how do we think about that? We are able to use our employee base. We are also able to use the kinds of studies that we can have third parties do. But a really important thing, I think, is just keeping a very open dialogue with the interested stakeholders who are more than just NGOs.
Can I just ask a really practical question of the companies? How many impact assessments have you done, and how long did it take, and how you know, is there like numbers you can give us at this point in time? Might give us an indication of how often. And
Well, we do have an impact assessment every time we enter a new country. And every time we enter a country, so it's once. And then we redid it recently for the whole group. And since, as I said, this is field are growing so fast, we do feel that we will need one every 2 or 3 years.
Patrick.
Yeah, so we're as if every time we consider entering a country and entering, but also when we consider and we decide not to enter a country, we've done a human rights impact assessment. But then the broader 361 that I have explained here, formally correct, you know, which can really be named a true human rights impact assessment. This is the one that we did and concluded a year ago. But definitely back to the question, how often do we need to do this? We do know that it needs to be done regularly and you know, not only this once. But it depends what you mean with the human rights impact assessment.
Yep.
There isn't a clear definition for what a human rights impact assessment is, and I think so for example, we'll do one if we're entering a country, you'll do one if we're, oh, sorry, Abelo Kobiyaho, sorry. I'm just talking to you guys. No. Hello. So we'll do one if we're entering a country, and then to Patrick's point, we'll do one if we're thinking about maybe entering a country, and then we'll do one if we think our services might impact a country, even if we're not actually there, and then we'll do one if we're about to launch a product, so it's specific to a product, and then we do one specific to a specific question. So someone will say, hey, I think there might be an issue with this particular potential business decision, but those are all differently scoped. So I think sometimes even the question of, do you do one or how many, there's a range of definitions of what it is.
Yeah, can I just add to that? There is also, which hasn't happened yet, but if a company would leave a country, that's when you also need to do a human rights impact assessment.
Great. I'm starting to see.
This is the point that just before you started I wanted to address, because as a service provider, clearly our role in the services that we provide companies is not to dictate to those companies when they do their human rights impact assessments. We try to respond when they come to us to address their needs as they see fit. But I just wanted to underscore what Patrick has just said, in that we've heard from a lot of companies here today. We've heard a lot of policy talk about doing the right thing. And I was just wanting to underscore that at what stage will ICT companies, or any other companies for that matter across sectors, be looking at doing exit strategies and doing human rights impact assessments to actually leave countries where you know, perhaps it's not worth it in the end to their bottom line, but I don't know if we're there yet. And I'd like the companies to respond to that, if they have any opinion on that.
So I think quick response on that now, and then I can see the hands starting to come up in the audience, so we'll go to Rebecca next.
Well, we fundamentally believe that our services are for good. There are problems and challenges, but our services and networks are for good. So there is no country on the list for leaving today, but the option needs to be, you know, considered. And if that would ever happen, it would be a question not for me, it would be for the company board, but it would need to entail a human rights impact assessment.
On our side, we ask many times the question, should we leave a country that do not respect the human rights? And the answer we got from, you know, stakeholders is say, no, absolutely not. Because you are concerned with human rights, you're fighting to do the little you can do, so you're better inside the country than any other company that will come, take the business, and do not respect anything. So this is where we stand on the subject.
I mentioned earlier we have a global human rights statement. One of the principles we are quite emphatic on in our statement is that people could disagree on this, but we think we are a greater force for good by being engaged than by withdrawing. You'd be a lot cleaner, it'd be a lot easier if you didn't work in difficult environments. We actually think with a mission to help people and businesses around the world realize their full potential, we need to work around the world. I will say I can't think of a country we have withdrawn from voluntarily. I do know that we have considered at very high levels for certain demands that might be made or we're hearing are about to be made. We will consider very carefully what would we do, knowing the consequence might be our service would be shut down, for example. So it's different from, we are not in the game of trying to withdraw, but we are in the game of engaging and letting people know that how we would respond to certain demands that we are hearing are coming our way. And I think that's the right kind of balanced approach to it. I would like to go back. I know you are interested in human rights assessments. I agree with Abeli from Yahoo. It's really difficult to define that. So we have some commission studies, and then we do a lot of things that actually go up to the senior owners of the business and engineering team saying, here is the issue, and then we will have a very rich discussion with senior people in the company about the consequences and make an informed decision. What we're trying to do is make sure we've identified the risks, had the right kinds of discussions, thought about what are mitigations either in the planning we do in advance or what we would do in the event of certain eventualities. But as I said, with most of our services, we actually think the best way to do it is to put those in country knowing that we're keeping the data in jurisdictions where we trust we'll have a very reasonable way of engaging if there is a demand for data we think is inappropriate for us to disclose. Ultimately, the cloud depends upon user trust, so we put that at the very top of our list as to a decision. We won't go into a place that we think is really going to compromise trust.
I want to come to a couple of questions from the audience now, so I'm going to hand over to Rebecca.
Thank you very much. My name is Rebecca McKinnon. Two questions. Now, most companies that are now doing human rights impact assessments weren't doing them before they went into a lot of the places that they currently are. So are sort of applying this process and policy sort of retroactively and trying to mitigate and kind of rethink a little bit kind of, you know, where you stand and where you go from here. I don't know how much the company people on the panel would want to speak to this really specifically, but perhaps those of you who've worked with companies might be able to speak in a little more detail. But if companies had been doing human rights impact assessment from the beginning before they started to expand internationally, would the map of where companies are look radically different? Would the nature of practices look radically different, or would we be roughly the same? I'm sort of interested in hearing, like, how different would things be today if human rights impact assessments had been embedded from before any of your companies expanded outside of your home country borders? I'd be interested in just hearing what people think about that. And then on a more practical level, with human rights impact assessments, the public doesn't know that these things exist. The public doesn't, you know, unless they're real wonks and geeks and are like scouring the GNI website and, you know, scouring certain websites that most people don't know exist. The public has no idea that your companies are doing human rights impact assessments. And so one question I have is, now obviously you don't want to be putting the results of your full human rights impact assessments out, you know, in public. That's counterproductive from a human rights standpoint, let alone a business standpoint. But would it not be, I think, kind of help to advance best practice in the industry if companies did report a bit more about the fact that they're doing them, what types of human rights impact assessments they do, some basic information about the scope and frequency and conditions under which human rights impact assessments happen? Would that not be a positive thing to help kind of raise the bar and create a bit more of a race to the top rather than everybody sort of doing these things and, you know, doing lots of good in secret?
Rapidly to your second question, Rebecca, it's on the way. This is what we're doing, actually. What we are presenting today to this session is what we were doing 6 months ago that we will report in our report that is coming out in a month from now. So you're an academic. You push questions too early in advance. We're doing it. This is a way. We want to share. We are in the industry dialogue sharing our practice. We have two different organization to do that for us also. We are sharing and we push that forward.
As to your question whether the map would look different, as I indicated before, there might be countries which we might have been looking upon but didn't enter. And so the map does look different.
And I think the three gentlemen here would have had less gray hairs if, but no offense. But I think the example Steve gives about the reflection that goes into building leverage into the business model when you place your presence could have been something that could have changed. So if you find yourself in a difficult country as a minority shareholder, you're a bit stuck. And if you had looked at human rights maybe before doing that, you would have had a different, if possible, a different model. So I think some of those changes, but broadly speaking for this sector and other sectors, human rights do not tend to be a showstopper for multinationals going in to new countries. So I think it's more the way you go in and you build leverage into your agreements and things like that. The public, yes, is not aware, and I think one of the points made in the GNI meeting in Brussels last year, that citizenship demand for better practice of their governments is a problem. You're facing demands from business clients, but not really from customers, private consumers, and that's got to change. And I think what we're doing with Lucy and her team in Myanmar is actually to do a human rights impact assessment in full public and say, for any company, these would be the issues. It would be impossible to enforce X, Y, and Z human rights principles given the current regulatory environment. So we actually get it out in the public without any one company has to stick their neck out. And I think that's part of also what GNI and the industry dialogue are about, but that sort of thing takes a lot of time.
Just quickly to respond, Barbara, and I thought it was a really great question. Your question about if companies are doing these impact assessments, are they putting them on their sites, are they reporting out? And the last session that was held, there was a lot of discussion about transparency and reporting, and specifically transparency and reporting as a citizen audit. And I believe it was the minister from New Zealand of ICT who made her last point on the first panel this morning, that the dialogue of transparency perhaps should move beyond the dialogue between the corporate sector and government, and that the transparency and reporting dialogue is actually with citizens. So to your point, that perhaps this is an interesting thing that multinational corporations would actually benefit from. And from my perspective, I think that this would also, for our clients, decrease their risk exposure if they were to invest in transparent reporting to the citizen level.
Great. I think we've got another. Oh, Steve, did you?
Because I know Rebecca's very interested in this. Let me just say, you did pose it, would it be better? And so in this world of hypotheticals, let me say most of our stuff that we actually document in detail, we will treat that as privilege. We'll have the lawyers deeply engaged, and there is a lot of very confidential information, including what sources we had, just reasons why we wouldn't want to make that public. But I would say, and it's a discussion we're having inside the Global Network Initiative, what's our opportunity actually to develop even a checklist of questions? Not that everyone does these questions, but there might be 10 segments and you should be asking some questions from this list or something. That's an area where I think there'd be opportunity to get the companies and get industry to say, yeah, we can say here are the kinds of questions we have asked about this sort of issue, which then, of course, it'll be your job as an academic to keep pushing for more, and our job will be to do the right things and have the right level of engagement with, because we do view this as part of our corporate citizenship. As a global citizen, we do need to have that dialogue. It's just at what level of detail is appropriate.
Patrick.
Yeah, as explained at the beginning of this session, we elaborated part of further elaborated the tool which Danish Institute already had in place as to the issues freedom of expression, privacy, and protection of children. And we have said to the Danish Institute that please use this in further discussions with other companies so that that knowledge can be built upon.
I think we've got a question over here.
I was going take the opportunity to respond to some of the questions from the panel in that you posed first, if I may. So I'm Luke Wild, I'm from Trade 50, and we're a business consultancy, work with a company on their human rights implementation. We've done a couple of human rights impact assessments, particularly in the tourism sector. And I guess, some of what I was going to share was, what we've found from that experience. And we've taken a particular focus. I think Eve said something about, which I would characterise as saying that actually that human rights issues occur in specifics, as Roosevelt said, in small places close to home. And so your frontline management need to be capable of dealing with the issue there and then. So we've put a particular focus on designing processes that involve the frontline management in the localities so that we can skill them up so that we leave a lasting legacy within the businesses. And I think that sort of comes back to, how often do you do human rights impact assessments? I have a vision, I hope that we're not talking about how often, because it becomes an ongoing and continuous process. It's going to take us some time to get there. And most of my counsel to companies about how you start is doing exactly the sort of process you're going through and finding some pragmatic place to start and some practical places to start. And what we're finding is, if you've done, 2 or 3, the company in particular we've been working with in the tourism sector has now just completed its second human rights impact assessment, done one in Kenya, one in India. You can already see some consistent themes beginning to come through. And so, there's some opportunities to start to address those consistent themes, perhaps on a more global level, before you have to roll out any further. I think another quick couple of things, and what we've been trying to do there is to build them a toolkit that they can then use and implement themselves in all kinds of different situations. And it's already been voiced that there are different occasions when you might want to do some form of assessment. A couple of things that we've found is to be careful about perceived wisdom and indices and experts, because actually, what's happening there on the ground is changing day by day by day by day by day. And and as we can obviously see, I was in Kiev last year. The picture is very different now in Kiev, as we've been talking about this morning. And what we found in undertaking an impact assessment in Kenya was, yes, all the perceived international wisdom of experts tells you so much, but actually going out and talking to the local communities, particularly drawing that lens into who are some of the most vulnerable groups within those communities, and talking to them really starts to untap to some of the areas that I think is where the value is. It's the risks that you haven't thought of, because we're all pretty sophisticated companies. We've already got pretty sophisticated risk management systems in place dealing with the known risks. So it's being sensitive and being very open to some of those potentially unknown risks. Now, it doesn't always, what we produced, if you like, what we found was intelligence, which at times has now been investigated further, and there isn't a risk there. But other times there is. And I suppose there's been quite a lot of questions which I would summarise as, when do you know what you're doing is good enough, whether that's in terms of your overall plan or in terms of the specific process? And what we've been trying to do is put in a sort of form of stakeholder governance, multi-stakeholder governance into the process. So have a small, modest oversight group of NGOs overseeing the process. Now, I partly do that because we as a private sector business are no more trusted than you are, and therefore we need that coverage when we do impact assessments, unlike perhaps the Danish Institute, who've got their own its own credibility. But I think it also gives the company some credibility to say, we've been involving UNICEF or Rebecca or whoever else in this process. And because at the end of the day, it's going to become a learning process. We're not going to get it 100% right. We're on we can involve people and be on the journey together, and we need to be kind of pragmatic about what companies can bite off and practically do. And that's the best way that I've found of trying to establish good enough and keep the process rolling and maturing, and the companies learning and us all learning together, really. Sorry, hogging the microphone.
Thank you. I want to just pose one further question to the panel, and then we'll throw it back out to the audience again. So I was really interested in a sort of broader question. So moving away from the very kind of specifics, how often and where and when, to whether there's the potential to use company human rights impact assessments as a kind of segue to national engagement and national dialogue with stakeholders at a countrywide level. I'd just be interested in the views of the companies if you found in any of the human rights impact assessments that you've carried out that you've then taken the outcomes of those impact assessments to then engage in a particular country, and then also to see if Lucy, Alan and Liz have any responses or thoughts on that as well.
I guess doing those human rights impact assessment is to reach the fact that we can open a dialogue. I mean, this is a goal, definitely. I have a hard time to answer your question because we haven't done it yet. But we're definitely going to be transparent on it. As I said, we're going to publish that on our CSR report. So the country that have been degraded with the human rights impact assessment will be known and written into our report. So we hopefully can address NGOs locally. It's going to be the easiest way to start with, and then push on to governments. But for the moment, we haven't done it.
This just reminds me of some conversations I had with some companies, because I was kind of interested in how startup companies would, start to tackle these very big issues. You're a small company and then the next day you're valued at $1 billion and your service is all over. What do you do when you get your first government request for data? So I was kind of doing a little bit of research around this in London in the charmingly named Silicon Roundabout, which we have in the UK. And I was just asking the big companies, what advice would you give to startups if, you had your time again? And overwhelmingly the advice was, think about these issues from the start before you make a huge mistake and you have to rectify it later. And I think, in terms of everything that people are doing with, making some of your impact assessments public, Rebecca's project on ranking digital rights, the SWIAs that we're doing in Myanmar, all these bits of information are going to inform the next generation of companies and hopefully stop these mistakes happening again, because smaller companies are dealing with things that you just don't hear about because they don't have the voice or the access to speak about. So hopefully all of this information that you can make public will help the next generation of companies and also the governments to help those next generation of companies.
Patrick.
Yeah, as was intended, the human rights impact assessment that we did with the help of the Danish Institute very much informed management and internal company decision making. And one of the very tangible results is the TeliaSonera freedom of expression policy, which we adopted in December last year, and it's available on teliasonera.com. And work on how to implement that policy. It also follows from the industry dialogue work, of course. And I mean, when you go into the results of a very deep human rights impact assessment, you do a lot of learning, and that learning, of course, is helping inform decision making. In our case, it has resulted in this specific policy as the freedom of expression, amongst others.
Steve.
I find it hard to answer the question. With the larger companies and those who've been in the business for a decade or more, would be my guess, but certainly in a place like Microsoft or Yahoo, where we've been at it for decades, we actually have professionals who are hired in as human rights experts because they have expertise. And then for us, we have hundreds of people in Russia and thousands of people in China. We, as I mentioned, we view them as part of the family, and we expect them to be providing those inputs, helping us get the right kinds of inputs. And then international or other sorts of human rights conferences are a great way to get the dialogue that happens. And sometimes, as has been mentioned earlier, the most effective thing is not to be in a particular authority's face, as it were, and be really aggressive about what is being done that is not exactly what they would like to see be done, because then you're challenging them to find a way to stop an element of flexibility that's there. So we think that there's a real nuance in this thing, and we need transparency, we need people to have the dialogue, but we also need to stay focused. Not just are we thinking about what are the rights we're trying to protect, but actually, what are the avenues we need to protect in order to be better at protecting rights?
Thank you. I think there's a question over here.
Hi, I'm Eva. I work for Privacy International in the UK. There was an argument that was made earlier about how surveillance is a greater issue in a country like Azerbaijan than Sweden. I'm a bit wary of that argument because, well, I'm a French citizen living in the UK, and although I'm probably not going to get shot in the street, I still think my privacy is a right worth being protected. So from that, I wanted to ask a question to Yves Nissim. Because the newspaper Le Monde has exposed ties between Orange and both actually the DGSE, the French Secret Services, but also GCHQ. And so, I mean, unregulated ties and unregulated relations have been exposed, as well as, you know, the process of trying to break encryption. So you did say, indeed, that privacy until 2 years ago was not an issue that was debated. So now that it is very much a central issue in human rights debate. I mean, can French citizens also expect to have their human rights being respected?
Okay, we had a conversation on the subject of Le Monde's paper in Washington 2 months ago with Access. Actually, you asked the same question you just were asking. When we came back to the original information coming from Snowden, it was quite different from what Le Monde wrote, basically. Le Monde went a lot further into the allegations, saying that Orange was completely, working with the French government. And the answer is the following. We do have rules of law in France in which we have to answer demands from the government. At no time we did have people going back and forth from Orange to the French government, as Le Monde was saying. This never happened. We always ask a paper, an attorney demanding something, or a specific, process to get to our data. So this is what we answered to this allegation. Of course, we did provide information to the French government, but they followed the regular process to get the information. Now, in terms of a company, in terms of privacy, we made our own pride to try to keep privacy of our customers as a priority for us. And it's definitely a different position that telcos have as compared to internet company. We do not use our customers' privacy to do business. It's a completely different model. But of course, when we say that, we have all the possibilities that the government has to access to this data, and we need to follow. It's inside our license agreements with the government. We need to follow the process, and we have also all the hacking process in which people are getting into private data. Our president, about 3 months ago, came in front of the press and said, okay, we will guarantee to keep the privacy of our customers. And of course, 2 months later, 800,000 data from customers were stolen from hackers. It's a kind of game. As it was said this morning, security is a main issue, and we don't speak too much about security. It's a difficult subject. We are putting everything, this is our business model. We are putting everything in place to guarantee, privacy, but there's always, people that get through. And so we implement a new level of security, and again, they go through, and we do implement. This is the name of the game, basically. So question number one, yes, we did provide information to the government, but it was on a regular process. We were not volunteering doing that. And second, we will keep guaranteeing the privacy of our customer the best we can do. Okay.
Other questions from the audience? Yeah.
James Losey, Stockholm University. I'm curious. So in addition to the human rights assessments that are taking place when you first enter a country, are there types of assessments that are happening or should be happening more regularly, such as if specific to human freedom of expression and privacy, and what types of triggers cause these assessments to have a second look at an issue, such as a regime change or something else?
Well, I get back to my, when it comes, we have several human rights, but when it comes to freedom of expression, we have our specific policy, and in that policy we have defined what we define as major events, which is blocking of or a shutdown of networks or mandatory communications of government SMSs or something. And in that case, we have a policy and then an instruction which says that the decisions on how to act on the request or demand from the government is to be escalated within Telia Sonera, so that the difficult, challenging decision needs not to be taken locally. And then we're working, more or less daily on learning by doing. So receiving such major request demands and evaluating them, escalating them, and logging them. So ongoing work day by day.
Other questions from the audience? Okay, I'm going to take the prerogative of being the moderator and ask another question. So I'd be interested to hear from both the companies and from our three colleagues who are advising companies, just about the sort of challenges of integrating sort of due diligence and thinking about human rights into company processes across the board. I'm thinking back to my own experience when I was at British Telecom and the challenges that we had to integrate thinking around sustainability across all lines of business. And I'd just be interested to hear from the companies the kind of challenges that you've faced or that you're perhaps anticipating if you're starting to think about implementing human rights impact assessments, and then perhaps some broader comments from Lucy, from Alan, and from Liz. Who'd like to start?
Well, Microsoft has been at this for decades, as noted, and we're an engineering company with a deep engineering culture. So one of the learnings for us was we actually needed to put in place real processes, and you might recall a time at the turn of the century when there were a bunch of worms and things that were hitting Microsoft products, and so we created a trustworthy computing center. This was something Bill Gates was very adamant about. We funded it appropriately. We built then the processes, and we came up with a way to build trustworthy products. If you look today, you're not going to find lots of stories about worms in Windows. We took a similar process actually with human rights of realizing we needed what we called privacy by design, and took largely the same team and the same process. So we have privacy champs inside the product groups who are trained and responsible to be looking for the issues that should be escalated through our review process so that senior people get to look at it and make an informed decision. The reality is most people don't become software engineers because they're thinking first and foremost about human rights. They're trying to build something, try to do it elegantly, try to reach lots and lots of people and do something that hasn't been done. And it's not that they don't care about these things, but it actually has to be brought to their attention, has been our experience. So we've tried to build the processes to make sure that it happens organically inside the company.
One word about CSR. I took over the job 4 years ago, and when I took over, it was a legal constraint within the company. Today, we are part of the mainstream of the strategy of the company. We've had a special meetings with the CEO of the company who gave us a special task to be able to rewrite the whole strategy and make the whole business of the company to be responsible. So this is a part of the answer of your question.
Yeah, so whereas now many years ago corporate social responsibility, or CR, was more about charity and environment, today it's about all human rights, and it is and needs to be part of business strategy. And for my company, we have our sustainability department, but we also have an ethics and compliance officer and department, which looks after how we implement and look after our principles.
I could say something very geeky about embedding into existing systems, and that in an engineering company, every staff member will know a health and safety incident when they see one. Will they also know a human rights incident or near miss if they see one? Not quite yet, and that's a cultural issue which we need to get at. But I think to turn the question a little bit around at myself and some of you in the audience, what we need to avoid is to force companies into a situation where they need to continue to push human rights under the carpet because they're afraid legally. That has happened to some extent on anti-corruption, which is very difficult for companies to talk about because of the legal liabilities associated. And we must avoid to have this happen on human rights as well, because then these guys will not be able to talk and publish their impact assessments without fear of severe ramifications. So I think if there's one thing we can do as a critical audience to help the true embedding and implementation, that's one of the things that we should be very mindful of.
Yeah.
You disagree?
No, I don't disagree. I have a follow-up question on that, because obviously the concern about legal liability has to do, like with the U.S., there's the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and there's similar laws in a growing number of countries. And I just wonder how that observation you're making should be kept in mind. There's a number of pieces of legislation that have been proposed in the United States and in different parts of Europe. There's the Global Online Freedom Act that would require companies to do a number of things that's modeled in some ways after the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and there's proposals for similar types of legislation in some parts of Europe. And so I'm wondering, just given what you just said, and given sort of the cause of this fear of talking, how do we, legislate what needs to be legislated in a way that also doesn't chill companies being able to talk to stakeholders about what's going on?
And if you're asking me, I don't have an answer for that question, but I don't think legislators are currently thinking too much about that. So it's definitely something that needs to be addressed, so that we can have an open discussion about the issues, because the root causes behind the freedom of expression, privacy-related challenges that companies in this industry are facing are root causes that sit on the government side of the fence. So it's very important that companies can talk openly about it without fear of repercussions. And legislators need to have that in mind when they create regulation in this area.
I'm not sure I share the concern. We do annual online training for our people about business practices and correct ways to do business. And we always have something on corrupt payments or misbehaviors of that sort. And increasingly, I think companies are getting comfortable with the idea that part of what they need to do is their corporate social responsibility obligation is make sure they're giving training on these other issues as well. So in some ways, it's a notion. You mentioned it was only a few years ago that people really started talking about this, but I think it's growing momentum where people are less concerned about talking about it. The specific details of how they might resolve issues, that might still have legal liabilities, but I think companies are quite comfortable now talking about, and it's expected by our shareholders that we're able to talk about what we're doing to address these. Rebecca, did I miss your question in some way? Is there?
There's obviously different points of view in terms of in what situations does legislation actually kind of promote good behavior, and to what extent is it counterproductive. And there are different points of view on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and there are a lot of people in civil society who think you need to legislate against corruption. So yeah, it's tricky.
So we're coming to the end of the session. We've time for one last question, and it looks like we've got someone here.
Kathleen Reen with Internews. I was wondering if you could comment on the experience of propagating what you do within your organisations. Many of you are known for working really hard on these issues. You've been at it for a while. You're on the front lines. You turn up to conferences like this. You engage in the hardest conversations, but you are few, true? And your organisations have very small offices that are responsible for these specific issues, and increasingly as they go global, especially in emerging markets, it's not possible for you to be there on the ground, whether it's data retention or privacy issues or an oncoming law. What are plans going forward for moving that more fully through your organisations, and do you have plans for replicating yourselves into this, what will probably be a very long conversation going forward in other countries?
Well, first, talking to the telecom industry, and I'll let Jenai answer afterwards. We are opening the ID to more and more telcos and suppliers. We are on the line 2 or 3 new candidates to come in. We are now 9. It's not small. We represent most of Europe, and AT&T's just joined, so it's quite a big company. That's for external. Internally, this is part of the principles we do have. We have to roll out every single thing we're doing. And as I said to Rebecca, things are going now. We first wrote the principles. We engaged stakeholder dialogue in many instances, like you said. And now we are rolling out with the impact, human rights impact assessment done. We are going to roll that in every single country of our group.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe I mentioned this already at the larger panel this morning, but initiatives such as the industry dialogue really help in the internal company work. So when I, as an employee of TeliaSonera, talk to my management and I say, this is what we need to do, and we have discussed it with these other 8 companies, and they agree. They have the same challenges and the same way of thinking. It really helps to get momentum and get the ear of the management internally. Then, of course, sometimes we go the other way and try to push the industry dialogue to go further, but that's another question.
The internet companies had a wake-up call in 2005, 2006, and it in some ways fed into the creation of the Global Network Initiative. I don't think any of the internet companies are confused about the risks they run and the need to be thoughtful about this and to make it a core piece of what we view as compliance and the ethical behavior of an internet company at this stage. The Global Network Initiative now, it started as Yahoo, Google, and Microsoft, Facebook and LinkedIn have joined. So we are now increasing both the breadth of the companies who are deeply engaged and the breadth of the NGOs and academics and socially responsible investors engaged. So we actually have an active dialogue. We might be in a different position than the telcos are at this stage, in part because we had a cruder, harsher wake-up call.
So I promised Alan that I would finish this panel bang on time, and I think we're just coming up to being out of time. So I'd like to ask first of all everyone in the audience to thank the panel, not only for their great contributions but also for dealing with what, it has to be said, are fairly hot lights here. So thank you very much.